Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, back in May, Richard Hummel joined me from NETSCOUT on the podcast, revealing insights from a threat report. So when I hear phrases such as DNS water torture attacks and carpet bombing attacks are on the rise, combined with a new NETSCOUT Threat Intelligence Report, it was once again to get my go-to guy for cybersecurity threats on speed dial and invite him back onto the podcast. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening in the world, it's time for me to beam your ears all the way to Washington, D.C., where Richard will demystify some of the terminology around the threat landscape and much more. So a massive warm welcome back to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Neil. It's always a pleasure to be on with you guys here. My name is Richard Hummel. I work for NETSCOUT, specifically on the ACERT team. And what my team is responsible for is looking at the threat intelligence side of the DDoS attack landscape. And so I've been with the company for almost 5 years now. My background, I started in the Army. I went to private contracting, and then I did commercial space doing threat intelligence and cybercrime. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything here. But now, for the past nearly 5 years, been specifically focused on the DDoS threat landscape. And
for anyone interested in checking out your origin story, I'll post a link to our previous conversation where you talk about that in a little bit more detail. But of course, NETSCOUT, there will be some people listening that are hearing about you guys for the first time. So you can tell me a little bit more about the company and the kind of problems that you solve with technology.
Absolutely. So NETSCOUT's been around for over 30 years. And the primary goal in our jobs is what we call ourselves guardians of the connected world. And it's very, very true in that statement, because our job here is to make sure that people have access to the internet. A lot of the service providers around the world are customers of ours, a lot of really big enterprises. And these are people that are reliant on their connection to the rest of the world. Without that connection, they can't do business. Without that connection, their downstream consumers can't access the internet. And we know that in today's day and age, the internet is literally the lifeblood of our world, right? Without connectivity, what do we dissolve to, right? I think we dissolve into chaos at that point. And so our job really is to be those guardians and make sure that adversaries can't negatively impact those networks and they can stay up all the time.
And there'll be people listening that can't see your backdrop at the moment, but we talked about it before we started recording. You've got the whole Marvel Avengers thing going on. It's incredibly cool. You just mentioned you consider yourselves guardians of the connected world. Is there a big superhero theme throughout the company?
Completely unrelated. I will tell you this, that this office was my present to myself when I started working from home with NETSCOUT, but this was before we had that moniker. So it was kind of a weird coincidence here where I've got the Guardians behind me, and that's what we call ourselves here at NETSCOUT.
Fantastic. And one of the main reasons I invited you back on the podcast is NETSCOUT recently released its latest DDoS Threat Intelligence Report. Can you tell me a little bit more about the report and the kind of people you surveyed there?
Let's talk about the people we survey first. So go back 15 years, we used to do something called the Worldwide Infrastructure Surveillance Report, which was a survey. I always get that acronym mixed up. We stopped doing the survey because what we realized is that the visibility that we have just with our customer base doesn't require us necessarily to go out and survey anymore. And so when we talk about where we're getting this data from, it's all over the world. And one of the things that we did for this current threat report that we haven't really done before is we looked at where exactly are we seeing all this activity? And so we did things like, well, how many countries do we see DDoS attacks in? What are the total number of autonomous systems? In other words, the highest level of what an IP address would relate to. What geographies are we seeing these in? What industries? And it was kind of eye-opening when we looked at this. We're seeing attacks in over 190 countries and territories. Now there's 198 in the world, so you can do the math. We're seeing attacks in greater than 50,000 of the 90,000 active ASNs in the world. And we're seeing attacks in about 550 different industry verticals, and the North American Industry Codes has 900 on record. So we are seeing a large majority here of the world in terms of where we're seeing DDoS attacks. And so we take all of that information and we use that to fuel the threat intelligence report. Now, we don't charge for this. It's something that we brief to our customers, we brief to the public. We're doing something here on the podcast. The goal of this is we want to make sure that the rest of the world knows what's happening in the DDoS threat space. There's a lot of other vendors out there. There's peers. They all have great reports. They all do semi-annual threat reports. Some of them do quarterly, some do annual. They all have a different sliver or view of the threat landscape. And a lot of times you're going to have a more narrow focus because you might have a peer that's focused on defending websites. And so their visibility is based on maybe the enterprise and specifically websites. You might have others that are primarily focused on the enterprise. And so they're not going to hit the service provider space. We are not like that. We're probably one of the only vendors that actually sits in most of the world's first, second, third tier ISPs. That gives us unique perspective. And a large majority of DDoS attacks in the world happen inside service provider networks against downstream consumers for those service providers. And so we have this unique perspective here, and we'd be remiss if we didn't tell the rest of the world about that. And so that's our objective here. That's our strategic goal here is we want to take all of this information that our customers freely share with us and give it back to the world to say, this is what's happening. This is what adversaries are doing. This is how they're changing their tactics, how they're adapting their attack methodology. What do we need to do as security professionals to adapt our own practices and defend what the adversary is doing? And so this is really trying to be just thought leaders in this space, put the information out there, give some observations, give a little bit of recommendations, but ultimately educate the rest of the world about what is happening in the DDoS space.
And when you collate all that information, I'm curious, are there any big trends that immediately emerge? And what were the biggest takeaways from the report?
Yes, there's really some quite interesting findings this time. I would say the biggest sea change that we've seen is something that we talked about last time and is continuing. In the early part of 2021, what we started to see here was a sharp decrease in what we would call volumetric attacks. These are attacks that are from spoofed places. They're amplifying traffic using legitimate services and devices in the world, and they're overwhelming traffic systems with traffic. We have pretty easy ways to defend against that now. And I say easy, but it's taken us a long time to get people on board and to get folks educated enough to be able to do those mitigations. Well, that's happening now. That trend is taking place, and it has been ongoing for the past year and a half. And so what we're seeing here is more of these service providers, more of these big enterprises are starting to do simple things like source address validation, which essentially prevents spoof traffic into their networks. As they do that, these volumetric attacks that were all the rage for many, many years are now decreasing. And DNS amplification, which reigned king for like 3 or 4 years, is now number 3, and pretty soon is going to be like number 5 or 6 on the preferred vectors by adversaries. So what we're seeing is that TCP-based attacks, and breaking that down a little bit, I know we have a fairly technical audience, but when you're talking about spoof traffic and UDP attacks, you're talking about just blast it out, right? A spray and pray. You don't care if there's a response. You don't care what happens. The traffic just goes, and it's one way. When you're talking about a TCP connection, it's connection oriented. And so you're establishing a connection with the device and you're expecting a response. So just the very nature of these kinds of attacks mean that whatever system is being attacked has to allocate more resources to respond to that. And in fact, a lot of these attacks initially, when they first start, look like valid connections, because when I go to a website or I go to Facebook or Twitter, the first thing that's going to happen is I'm going to establish a TCP connection, and that's going to be a TCP send, SYNACK, send. And that's how it works. And so when you have this 3-way handshake, the servers are working overtime. Now, take all of that in mind and look at the threat landscape, and you can see all of the TCP-based attacks are accelerating. They're dominant by a large margin. In fact, TCP-ACK and TCP send both saw about 1.4 million attacks each, as opposed to DNS amplification, which was right around like 800 to 850,000. And so it's a big gap now. And a lot of the TCP-based attacks now are being launched from DDoS botnets. And that's even more important because these are not going to show up as spoofed, and they're going to show up as legitimate connections, and botnets can launch different kinds of attacks. We saw things like Maris last year with their HTTP pipelining, where it'll attack web servers essentially by queuing up a bunch of web server requests and then launching them all at one time. And so they are highly capable, and more, these adversaries are going after very high-powered devices, such as like servers or high-powered routers. We saw that a lot with the Maris and Venice, where they were going after MikroTik routers, which can sit in high throughput capacity networks. And then we have 5G. all these IoT devices getting more and more capacity on the internet. And so the botnet problem is escalating at the same pace as these TCP attacks are taking over. And so that's the biggest sea change that we have seen. And then if I had to pick a second one, and we can cover this maybe in another question, is seeing how the cyber world reacts to real world events. And I'm talking about the geopolitical nature of cyber attacks given, current events that are happening over in Europe. And so there's a lot to unpack there. I've done a number of sessions specifically just on the geopolitical influences and socioeconomics inside the cyber world, specifically as it pertains to DDoS. And there's really a lot to unpack there. I don't know if we'll have time to do it on this call, but maybe we can cover it here shortly.
I was going to say there's two big trends that I've noticed at the moment. One, I'm seeing more and more reports about teenagers being dragged into the world of cybersecurity because they're lured in by, obviously there's unemployment everywhere, and they're lured in by easy money and fitting into a group and getting the attention that they might be lacking in their life. And then also we've got the global conflict that we're seeing and state-sponsored attacks, etc. How does all that fit? Is that partly responsible for everything that you're seeing?
I think it's a large portion of it. In fact, I'll give you a quick tidbit on the teenagers. I would say it's not even teenagers, it's adolescents here, right? Yeah. This is like elementary education students getting in on the game. So in the report, in the North America section, we talk about elementary education showing up in the top 10 targeted industries that we have in the US. And elementary education has never appeared on that list before. Now, professional schools and universities has, because you've got a different tier of person, you've got a little bit more technicalities, you've got people that know how to do these things, maybe they've launched them before. And so it never even crossed my mind that we would see elementary education there. And what was even more intriguing is when I started to break down each of these industries, I assumed that the types of attacks would be consistent with the global trend, right? The TCP-based stuff, the declining volumetric. But with elementary education, that was not the case. In fact, the top three vectors, almost predominantly the only vectors that we saw against elementary education was UDP floods, basic UDP floods, just garbage traffic, DNS amplification, and NTP amplification. Now, all three of these, the one thing that they have in common is that every single DDoS attack or DDoS for hire service, boot or stressor service in the underground allows people to launch attacks for free with those attack vectors. Wow. Now, that's really insightful to me because we're talking about kids here, right? Kids that are like barely older than my own kids. Yeah. And my oldest is 8. In fact, there was a study in the UK in 2019 where they did a survey of elementary education students, and they found that children as young as 9 years old knew about DDoS and had engaged in launching DDoS attacks against something. And so we're talking about these kids, they have free reign, free access. If they have access to a device that connects to the internet, that's all they need. They don't need crypto wallets. They don't need accounts. You can do a bogus name, bogus email, and then you just need an IP address. And it's not that hard to look up on YouTube how to find somebody's IP address, right? And so you've got this ease of access and entry into this space that's just crazy. Now, pivoting a little bit over to the geopolitical space, we always knew that DDoS attack was used in some of these instances. Like we've been tracking many years back, DDoS used as a political tool to take down opposing websites or polling centers or whatever it might be. We've seen in the news China using their DDoS, what do they call it? The Great Chinese Cannon to take down opponents' websites, to attack Telegram, to take down communications for protesters. So we know that these guys do this. What was really insightful to me is that, just a precursor to Russia invading Ukraine, you have these DDoS attacks that just meant everybody was tuned in, taking down websites, taking down financial organization websites, taking down media websites. And that was really the entry into this war. And it was all centered around DDoS. Now, was DDoS the main attack? No, it wasn't. In fact, it was probably most likely a smokescreen, and the attacks weren't that big. But it brought a focal point here that DDoS is absolutely a normative now when it comes to this kind of kinetic warfare. And I anticipate that we're going to continue to see this. And it's not just nation state sponsored. It's all of these other opportunists that think, you know what, let me do this. I can launch an attack. Why not? It's free. It's easy to do. If I do have to pay, it's a little bit of money. And I don't have to own this stuff myself. I don't have to set up my own infrastructure. And so you've got all of these people getting in on the game. And then you have people calling others to join in. right? You've got all of these hacktivists that say, hey, let's hit Russia because they did this. And then you have, sympathetic folks to Russia like Killnet, who says anybody that stands against Russia or comments or says anything against them, we're going to go after you. Like right now, they have an operation where they're trying to take down travel sites and airline sites in the US because we support what's happening with Ukraine. And so it's just all of these different things intermingling here that are creating this really interesting ecosystem of cyber paired to real world events that I find really intriguing.
Yeah, and there's so many different Telegram groups as well that are recruiting new younger cybercrime members as well. It's just insane when you go down that rabbit hole. But I also read that DNS Water Torture attacks accelerated in 2022 with a 46% increase, primarily using UDP query floods, while carpet bombing attacks experienced a big comeback too, especially towards the end of the second quarter. And I'm quite aware that as soon as I say things like DNS Water Torture and UDP query floods and carpet bombing attacks, I'm going to be losing a few people here. So as they say on Reddit, can you explain all this to me like I'm five?
Yeah, let's do it. So when we talk about DNS water torture, let's cover that one first.
Yeah.
So when you enter a website, and I'm just going to use NETSCOUT as an example, and I go netscout.com, I'm going to send a request out and I'm going to look for that website. And so you're going to have internet exchanges and you're going to have a DNS exchange, and you're basically going to be directed to that site. Now, what happens if I were to say bogus.netscout.com? Now, do we have that subdomain? No, we don't. But because that top level domain is legitimate, our servers or the servers handling that request have to actually process it. And they have to query netscout.com to say, hey, is there a subdomain with this? And so they're already processing that request. It's not like just some bogus thing that's going to immediately come back as negative. And so what adversaries will do is they'll generate just thousands, tens of thousands of random subdomains, and then they would just flood a server with that. And so the server has to respond to all these because the top level domains are legitimate, but those subdomains are not. And so it's all bogus traffic. It's never going to resolve to anything. And that's going to cause the server to tip over, or at least slow down. So when we talk about DNS water torture, it really is an application layer attack. You're going after the services that are handling that resolution. As far as carpet bombing goes, this is a phenomena where instead of targeting one thing, I'm going to target all the things. And this doesn't always happen when a large majority of the attacks, because most attacks are related to gaming in some way. So an opponent targeting somebody else, or somebody betting on somebody targeting one particular person. And so you don't often see carpet bombing in kind of the wider scheme of things, like 85% of the DDoS attacks. Carpet bombing is most often used targeting like enterprises or various other organizations that own large IP blocks. And so what a lot of these adversaries have realized is that if I launch a single attack and I launch a big flood against that, I'm going to trip a threshold. That threshold is going to start countermeasures and mitigations for DDoS. And so they're like, well, what if we target all of their IP addresses, but we figure out what that threshold is, and then we send just enough traffic to all of their IP addresses to not trip that single one IP threshold. And so now they will flood all of your pipes with just enough traffic to stay under that threshold. And now all of a sudden, when it does trip, you have to scramble to defend attacks from all over the place. And so the way that the scrubbing works is typically we'll scrub a very specific segment of traffic to eliminate adversary stuff. But if we're getting traffic on all of our nodes, we have to scramble to try to figure out how to do that. And so that's a little bit more complex problem to deal with. And so that's what we talk about when we say DNS water torture and then carpet bombing. And we're seeing a lot more of this as adversaries increase their sophistication in going after organizations.
Well, one of the big aims of this podcast is to demystify some of these big words, buzzwords, and complex technology. You've just done a beautiful job of that. And someone that's right in the heart of this space, you've seen most things a million times before, I would imagine. But was there anything else that surprised you in the report this year?
You know, I can't say that there's any one thing necessarily that stood out more than the other. I think there was a lot of surprises. There was a lot of really interesting aspects. One thing kind of related to the geopolitical stuff that we just talked about that was a little eye-opening to me. In fact, something that we're currently researching further right now was in Ukraine, we saw a big spike in attacks. But then shortly after those attacks, we saw a pretty big decrease. In fact, we saw less attacks in Ukraine than we normally did on a day-by-day basis. And it left me scratching my head, like, attacks are still ongoing. We're still hearing about them in the news. We're still seeing websites go down. Why aren't we seeing attacks in Ukraine? Yeah. It turns out what happened is that as infrastructure is destroyed, or as infrastructure moves to other countries to support websites and services, the attacks move with them. And so, for instance, Ireland, right around the time that Ukraine saw that decrease, Ireland started to see an increase because they offloaded a lot of infrastructure that previously was housed and used in Ukraine for websites and services is now in Ireland. And another interesting perspective is that right around that same time frame, US-based satellite telecommunications companies said, hey, go ahead and use our systems. Starlink and a couple of other ones offered a lot of these. In fact, I think Elon Musk just recently came on record and said they have 25,000 hubs operating in Ukraine now. Well, we saw an 18% bump in attacks against US satellite providers at that same time period, right around when they started offering these services to Ukrainians. And so a lot of the attacks that we were seeing, they didn't stop, they just kind of migrated. Yeah. And so often we'll hear about, okay, this thing is out, or Down Detector will say, hey, this service is impacted, or we're not seeing traffic here. But we rarely hear about what happens afterwards. Where does that traffic go? It doesn't just stop. And so that's a really interesting kind of research avenue that we're pursuing is we want to see what happens after that. We want to see where that traffic goes. Where does it egress? How does it migrate? How does the DNS resolutions work? And so that was a kind of eye-opening to me as we were researching some of this data.
Wow. I do suspect we might have scared the heebie-jesus out of a fair few people listening today. So if we have any business leaders listening that we may have alarmed, what should they be doing, especially in the run-up to the holiday season? Because we see a lot of DDoS attacks taking down big stores. I think it happened at Macy's a few years ago, and the busiest day of the year, they were taken down. So is there anything that they should be doing in the run-up to the holiday season? And also, to leave everyone on a more positive note, what makes you hopeful about the future?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. I think the first thing is listen to this podcast. Yeah. Understand that threats are out there and how they're impacting things and what kind of vectors there are. And the threat report that we publish is phenomenal for that. In fact, we have an entire what we call periodic table of DDoS attack elements. And in there it lists all of the attack vectors that an adversary can use for DDoS. And you can click on each one and you can read about how they work. You can read about how many abusable devices there are, how many attacks we've seen. And so you can get a picture of what it is you should be concerned about. And so education is half the battle. If you know that the attacks are out there, then you can start taking steps to prepare. And prepare you must. This is not an if, but a when. And so understanding that you will be impacted at some point by DDoS, just having a DDoS service in place doesn't really matter necessarily who you go with. I mean, I will say, obviously, NETSCOUT's the best, but that's my bias here. But having something in place is going to stop the vast majority of threats. You may get a very persistent adversary that tries a bunch of things, and they can get around countermeasures and mitigations. But a lot of times when you hear about the success of DDoS attacks, it's because the target was wholly unprepared to handle it. The attacks against the websites in Ukraine, when it first started, none of them had DDoS mitigation services. They do now, but they didn't at the time. So a lot of the successes that we're seeing is because organizations just didn't realize it was a threat, or didn't think they were going to get attacked, or just deferred it down the road. And so prepare, understand that you will at some point likely be targeted by a DDoS attack, or at least experience a ripple effect from DDoS, and making sure that you have adequate measures in place. Now, you can do some statistical analysis. You can use the threat report and you can look, I'm this industry, I'm in this country or this region. Just show me what it is out there that's impacting this particular sector in this region. And then use that as a baseline to estimate what you might get attacked with. And then that will help you to understand how you need to prepare for this. And so that's really, really important. Preparation is key. That's going to get you 80 to 90% of the way. Mm-hmm. And then as far as what to expect over the holiday season, it's always November, December, January timeframes are always the highest volume of DDoS attacks that we see. In fact, if I go back to January of I think it was maybe January of this year, or no, January 2021, the highest amount of attacks we've ever seen in 1 month. Now, that was still COVID pandemic time. Everybody was shopping online. There was lots of online activity happening, but that was a lot of attacks. It was almost 1 million attacks in a single month, which is crazy. And so I would say that over the holiday period, just know that attacks are going to ramp up. You're going to have different things out there that may cause DDoS attacks, like bots out there trying to buy things or to queue up for different things. So there are a lot of attacks that will be representative or like a DDoS attack that may not be a DDoS attack. But just understand that it's going to happen, and it always happens around the holiday season. And so make sure that you're prepared to handle it.
Wow, fantastic advice. It's an absolute pleasure to get you back on. And for anyone listening that just wants to find out more information, dig a little bit deeper on that report, what's the best starting point for everything?
netscout.com/threat report. That's going to give you, so we actually did it different this time. Normally we do one report and you can download that one report, but we actually broke it out into 8 reports this time. And so we have a detailed narrative on each region. And under each region, we have multiple countries. I think we've got like 28 different country pages that you can view. And then we have 4 white papers, if you will. When you go to the website, it's just a truncated form. You can download a PDF. In that PDF, it's going to include all the details. So those PDFs include the geopolitical conversation in depth about what we were just talking about. So definitely encourage you for that. There's a botnet PDF. We have one on attack vectors and methodologies, some of what we talked about with carpet bombing and DNS water torture. And then we have one on something we call adaptive DDoS and DDoS suppression. And this is talking about how adversaries are adapting, how we need to adapt, and what we can do to suppress those attacks before they ever begin. So I encourage you guys to look at all those. There's a lot of additional resources, but that's where I would direct you to start.
Fantastic. Well, I don't know about everyone listening, but I myself have learned so much today, and I think you've just done an amazing job at demystifying some of those cybersecurity trends and attack trends. But we'll have to invite you back on next year to complete your hat trick of appearances and dig a little bit deeper on some more evolving trends. But excellent. But just as always, a huge thank you from me for agreeing to come back on today.
Awesome. Thanks, Neil, for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you guys.
I just love how Richard is able to demystify and talk about and break down some of the complexity in the threat landscape and talk about it in a language that everyone can understand. And I really do hope that everyone listening found today's episode as valuable as I did. It's just the kind of guy I could chat to for hours about this stuff. So I do look forward to getting him back on next year and completing that hat trick of appearances. But over to you. You've heard from me, you've heard from Richard today, but if you've got any insights that you'd like to share, if you'd like to come on the podcast or just ask a question, whatever it is, just send me an email, techblogwriter@outlook.com, or visit my website, techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll see over 2,100 other interviews, ways you can work with me, and how you can contact me. But that's it for today's episode, so a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.